A friend of mine called me up to ask me if I could do something for him. He's trying to get t-shirts printed with his company's logo on them. But when he sent the logo to the t-shirt company, they said that the file wasn't going to work the way that he sent it to them and that they needed a vector format. Now, he had no idea what that meant, but he knows that I'm a designer, and he figured that I probably knew what that meant and could convert whatever he had into vector. Now, that is already sending up some red flags in my mind, but it got even worse once I actually saw the file. So here's his company logo for his company called School of Potion. And as you can see, it's not very big, and if we look right here in the file name, it is a JPEG. So sure, right there I understand that the t-shirt company needs a vector file, like an Illustrator document, to be able to print things and to scale it up nicely. But this image is a raster image. It is not vector, it's raster. If you remember, I mentioned that Photoshop is a raster program where Illustrator is vector. Now, what exactly does that mean? Well, if I zoom in on this image, right now we're looking at it at 100% scale of what he had, what he sent to me. But I'll zoom in here, and the further I zoom in, the more kind of like blurry or blocky or grainy or pixelated this image gets. That might be a term that you've heard before or even used before, and it's a term that's used to describe an image that is low resolution. And that term really only applies to raster graphics. And that's because raster graphics are not calculated mathematically using lines and points like vectors were. If you remember, I'll jump into Illustrator. If I were to draw any shape, like this circle here, I could zoom in nice and close as much as I want, and it will always be 100% clean and crisp. Or I could scale it, down and back up again, and it's never going to lose any kind of quality. But if I make this nice and thick, and we come up to this view, there's an option right here to see your pixel preview. And if I turn that on, it looks fine at this point. If we look right up here, we're looking at this at 69%. If I press Command 1, that's going to zoom to 100% resolution. In other words, this is exactly the dimensions of my artboard scaled 1:1. So 1920 pixels wide by 1080 pixels tall. It still looks fine, but as soon as I start zooming in past that, now I'm at 200%, Command plus to zoom in again and again and again, suddenly this doesn't look so clean. And that's because I'm looking at this in my pixel preview mode, which is rasterizing my vector graphics. It's giving me a preview of what this would look like if I exported it in a raster format like a JPEG, just like you've been turning in your assignments. As soon as we leave this vector environment that Illustrator gives us and export it as a raster image, then the graphics are made up of these individual little squares. Now I'm zoomed in here at an extremely close level at 6,400%, and we see this little grid of squares. These grids are representing the individual pixels that are making up this raster preview, or this actual raster image. And you may not have even realized this, but every image that you've ever looked at on any screen is being displayed by tons, and I mean millions, of these tiny little squares called pixels. There are programs and browsers and applications that can support vector graphics and scale them infinitely with no loss of quality, but ultimately that image is going to be rasterized on your screen for you to actually see it, whether it's just on your actual monitor or the program itself is rasterizing the image. The benefit of working in Illustrator with these vector graphics is that it can continuously rasterize this. So no matter how you're looking at it, it's always going to be 100% clean and crisp. So as long as your pixel preview is off. So I'm going to uncheck that to get back to my clean vectors. But let me go ahead and bring that image into Illustrator. So I'm going to come up to File, Place, and find that logo on my desktop. There it is, School of Potion, and place it. And I'll click once to add it there and center it up in my artboard. Now that's extremely small, so I'm just going to scale this up to maybe 800 pixels wide. So I'll double click on the width, type in 800. And a little detail you need to be aware of is this little button right here. This is the Constrain Width and Height Proportions. Just like when you're scaling something around and you hold down Shift to constrain the proportions, I have this little chain link checked so that it constrained the proportions when I scaled this up. So if I were to type in, 1600, it's going to scale up proportionally. But if I uncheck this and scale this back down to 800, then it's only going to scale the width, and now my image looks stretched. It's awful. But that's just in this application. For an image, I don't want to stretch it out like this. But let me undo to get back where we were. And let's say it was a rectangle. Maybe I want to make this a specific width and height. Well, then I'm not going to want this constrain width and height proportions checked. I'm going to want to be able to say something like 400 by 1200. And that way it's going to let me scale each dimension freely. All right, let me get rid of that and we'll get back to this logo. Now again, because this is a pixel-based image, a raster graphic, I'm not able to select all these individual objects and manipulate them the way that I can with these vector paths inside of Illustrator. It's all one giant mosaic, basically, of these tiny little squares that are all colored differently to make up this image, which at a 100% scale would look fine. But because this image was so small, I cannot scale it up hardly at all before you start to notice that loss in quality. Unfortunately, I've had my fair share of clients, just like my friend here, who do not understand the difference between raster and vector. They have no idea what a pixel is. They have no idea what a vector path is. So this kind of a situation gets run into a lot, especially with printers. Most times printers need that vector format, especially for t-shirts, so that they can scale these images up and down however they need to and print them out with transparency and just have complete control over what is being output. And a raster image is just not going to give them that flexibility. Unfortunately, my friend does not know where that original vector file, probably an Illustrator file for this logo, is, and he's on a tight deadline, so he really needs to get this turned around and sent to the printers as quick as possible. So that puts me in the unfortunate position of having to recreate this logo from scratch using his low-resolution image as a reference. But like I said, that actually does happen in the real world, so I'm going to go ahead and do this and show you how I approach it. First things first, I'm going to come over to my layers and organize this. I'll call this reference, lock that layer, and then make a new one and call this logo. And think about how I'm going to attack this. Now the logo really isn't all that complex. It is made up of some basic shapes with some manipulated paths, and I think I'll be able to tackle this in a pretty straightforward manner. First of all, let's take a look at the main objects of this bottle. We've got this outer glass, we've got the neck, kind of this mouth, and the cork. And then we have, things like this liquid on the inside, and then the little details in the cork and the liquid, and then a couple of chips in the glass, and then a section of the cork missing. But that really is essentially all that's making up this logo. It's these basic shapes that I think I can recreate mostly from rectangles and then modifying their paths. It's fairly symmetrical, and it's all very clean, so it shouldn't be too hard to recreate, even with this low resolution image. So let's go ahead and just start with this outer section of the glass bottle. I'm going to do this using a rectangle. So I'm just going to find my rectangle tool, swap my fill and stroke so I have a stroke there, and then make it black just so I can see it nice and clear. And I'll take a look. I have my stroke set to 1 point. That's fine. And the way that I'm going to kind of estimate where I want this rectangle to be is looking at the extremes. Again, the highest point, the lowest point, and the widest point. So it looks like this is the left edge extreme, the right edge extreme, so I'm going to kind of line it up with that, and then the bottom edge. And it's fine if this isn't perfect. I can always modify it, but then bring it up to the top edge and out to the right extreme there down at the bottom right side. So something like that for the rectangle. But then I want to make sure that it's perfectly aligned in the center. It looks like his logo was very center aligned in his document, so I'll just center that up on the horizontal center and then zoom in here nice and close. It looks like my lines were pretty dead on, but a little bit off. I'm basically looking at the very center point where that line is darkest. When you zoom in, you can kind of see there's some lighter blue pixels here and some lighter blue pixels here. But right here in the center is what I'm shooting for. That's where I want the middle of my path to go. Alright, now let me zoom out and do the same thing with the top edge. Right about there looks like the center. Oh, maybe not. I'm going to move it down and then back up. There we go. Now I can see nice and clearly that center line. I think that's going to work. And the left and right edges look pretty good. I might want to bring them in just a little bit. So I'm going to hold down Option to scale this proportionally or symmetrically and bring it in just a tad on those edges. There we go. That looks good. Now when I manipulated the scale of that rectangle, you probably didn't notice, but if we take a look at the stroke, it's no longer set to 1 point. It's now 0.989. And why in the world did that happen? Well, if I zoom out pretty far and I scale this up a lot, then you see that my point size is now 3.848. So the stroke width is actually being scaled when I scale the object, and that's an option that you can change inside of Illustrator. Sometimes you might want that when you're scaling up a logo like this. You want the stroke width to be maintained. Other times you don't. In this case, I don't. So I'm going to zoom in here, set that back to 1, and then deselect. Just click off of everything, and then my preferences are going to show up in my properties panel. And right here, scale strokes and effects is checked. So that's telling me that it's going to scale that stroke width as I'm scaling with those transform controls. And I don't want that, so I'm going to uncheck it. That is definitely a very valuable thing to know how to do inside of Illustrator. All right, now that that's out of the way, I want to bring these 2 points in symmetrically, because clearly the top points of this bottle are closer to the center than they are down at the base. And I'm going to need to round off all the corners, but I'll do that after I've positioned my anchor points. So with my direct selection tool, I could select one of these anchor points and then, tap it in, maybe hold shift to do it a little bit faster. But then I'm kind of going to have to count the number of taps on the arrows that I use to get that one there, so I can remember to do it the same amount on this side. But there's actually a much easier way. So let me undo back to my perfect rectangle and draw a selection around both of those anchor points at once. Now we're going to use a new tool right over here. This is the scale tool, and the keyboard shortcut is S. Very easy to remember. But if I click on that, I'm going to get this little crosshair in between those 2 points, right in the center. That is called the center point, and it's going to show up in the direct center of whatever you have selected. So if I were to select this as a whole and then switch to the selection tool, now that center point is right there in center of the entire object. What this is going to let you do is now click and drag to scale the object freely. So on the X and Y axis, or if you hold shift, you can scale it proportionally, or just on the X axis, or just on the Y axis. So you have options there. I don't want to actually do that. I'm going to make my selection of those 2 top anchor points again, press S to get to that scale tool, and now I'm right there in the center of these 2 points, which exist on the same Y position. Because of that, I can only scale it on the X axis. So that's exactly what I want. So I'm going to click and drag and scale that in until this point kind of lines up with the center of the original source artwork. So let me bring that in just a little bit more. It looks like that's the widest point of that section of the rectangle at that top part just before it starts to round off. So that worked out perfectly. Before I move on, I just really quickly want to show you another option you have with the scale tool. If I were to select this object as a whole again and press S, I don't have to keep my center point right in the center of my object. Instead, I could, turn on my smart guides and then come down to this anchor point and click once, and now my center point is down there, or my anchor point, and then click and drag, and it will scale off of that point. I'll undo that, and then I could have, clicked off over here. Click and drag while holding shift, and it's going to scale from that point. So that's a very useful way to be able to scale things based on other parts of your document. Okay, let's move on. We're going to take a look at these curves. Right now I have a trapezoid, right, with very straight edges and sharp corners. This bottle, though, is curvy. It has a nice bend to it that kind of tapers off towards the top, and then all the corners are round. First things first, I want to do this curve right here, and then I'll move on to the round corners. So I need to introduce some handles to my trapezoid. I'm going to switch to my anchor point tool, Shift C on the keyboard, and then click and drag to introduce handles. I'll hold Shift and just pull this one out pretty far down here. Now I don't need a handle on this side of the anchor point, so I'm just going to bring that back in. And I'm not going to worry about the right side just yet. I'll move down to the left bottom point and click and drag while holding Shift and pull that up quite a bit. There we go. I'll get rid of this handle. And now, just to be able to see my path more clearly, I'm going to switch to my outline view, which is Command or Control Y. And there we go. There's the nice isolated path. We can see that curved shape. All right, Command Y to get back, and then I'm just going to zoom in nice and close and take a look. Looks like this handle right here might be able to be pulled down just a little bit more so that fits the shape of the actual source logo a little bit better. Great, I think I'm happy with that, and I could do the exact same process on this side, but I would never be able to get it perfect. So instead, I'm just going to delete these 2 points over here, and then I'm going to reflect this object onto that side. Now before we use the object transform reflect command to be able to do that, but there's another tool that we have access to called the reflect tool right here. It's actually underneath the rotate tool, which we'll get to in a second, but the keyboard shortcut is O. I don't really know why. I have memorized that, but it doesn't really make any sense to me why they chose O. But regardless, the reflect tool also has a center point show up in the middle of your selection. And what this allows you to do is reflect around that center point. So I don't want this to reflect around the center of this path. Instead, I want it to reflect around the center of this logo. So first I need to duplicate my path, Command C to copy, Command Shift V to paste in place. So I have 2 copies of that same path right on top of each other. And then I'm going to click once right about the middle of where I think the center of this is. It's okay if it's not perfect, but the center point right there. Click and drag, and this is going to let me freely rotate and reflect at the same time at any angle. Again, this is just like the object transform reflect. I don't know why you would ever reflect something off of a different angle, but you can do it. I don't want to do that, so I'm going to hold down that shift modifier key to do that proportionally, and look at that. That actually is lining up very closely on the right edge, and I think I can actually leave it just like it is. Alright, now I just need to close off the path, so I'm going to select both of them, press Command J to join this top portion, and this part down here is still open, so I'll press Command J one more time to make it a closed path. I'll switch to my outline view one more time, and now we can see that nice shape that kind of tapers off at the top, and I can move on to rounding the corners now. So it looks like the top 2 corners are rounded a little bit less than the bottom corners. So I'm going to start with just the bottom corners, select both of those points with the direct selection tool, and then round them off. So we'll make that nice and round somewhere around there. It looks like maybe even 30 pixels exactly will be great. So I'm going to just leave it like that and make sure that is indeed 30 pixels. Great. Then I'll select these top 2 points right here, drag them down, and it looks like 20 might be the magic number for those ones. Maybe a little bit further. 22? Yeah. 21. We'll leave it at 21 pixels for the top corners and take a look at that. I think that looks really close to the same shape. Now I just want to make the stroke a little bit thicker so that it matches a little bit more closely. It looks like about 6 points is the same stroke thickness as everything else. And then I just want to turn that layer off and back on so I can kind of compare the contours of my shape with the original shape. And before we move on, I just want to talk about one more transform control that we have access to, since they all kind of work similarly together. We've already talked about the scale tool, we've talked about the reflect tool, but lastly is this rotate tool. These are 3 tools that I'm using constantly. The keyboard shortcut for this one is R, easy to remember, and this again gives us that center point and allows you to click and drag to rotate an object freely. But just like the other 2 transform controls we've already talked about, I can click once anywhere and rotate it around that point. So let's say that I just had a circle and I had it over here, and I knew that for whatever reason I wanted this to rotate around the center of this circle. Well, I'll just turn on my smart guides, make sure they're on, press R to get my rotation tool, click once right in the center of that circle, and then it will rotate around it. So these are very, very useful tools to know how to use and can help you make transformations really, really quickly. So let's go ahead and move on to the next shape, which is just a simple rectangle right here. So rectangle tool, and then with my smart guides enabled, I can make sure that I'm snapping right there to that line, drag it up, move it over, and there we go. That looks dead on. I'm just going to make sure that it's perfectly centered in my document. There we go. And then I can move on to the next shape, this mouth of the bottle. So I'm going to copy and paste this in place. Command C to copy, Command Shift V to paste in place, and then just transform this up and then widen it while holding Option to do this symmetrically, and then round out these corners to fit. Now this is a little hard to do with the actual stroke being so thick, so I'm just going to temporarily turn this back down to 1 point and make sure that my curves are matching up. Looks like that roundness might need to get pushed out just a little bit, and I'm just going to round off the corners. Right now it's 14.9, so I'm going to turn it up to 15 and just call it a nice round 15. There we go. And I'll turn this point size back up to 6. And last up of the main geometry is this cork. So I'm going to duplicate this object by holding down Option and then clicking and dragging on it. And I want to constrain those proportions, so I'm going to hold Shift to bring it straight up. Which, by the way, this is a good time to point out a little bit of button pressing order that you need to be aware of in Illustrator. Let me just bring this over here for a second. The order that you press the modifier keys down on the keyboard matters. So if I wanted to constrain the proportions or the movement of my object when I'm dragging this or duplicating it and dragging it, I'm going to want to hold Shift while I'm doing that so that it only moves horizontally or vertically. But if I hold down Shift before I click, it deselects. And that's actually something that you want. You want the functionality of being able to add or subtract from your selection by holding down Shift. With this object selected, I can press Shift, click on this one. I'll keep holding down Shift and click on another object. That's great. But if you're wanting to use Shift to constrain the movement, that can be pretty frustrating. If you have your object selected, hold down Shift, and then click and try and drag, it's going to deselect. So you really need to start thinking about how your modifier keys are going to affect your interactions with the software. So to duplicate this object, I want to first have it selected, hold down Option, and that gives me my little double selection tools, letting me know that it's going to duplicate. I'll click and drag, and then hold Shift to constrain that movement. Then I'll just move it up right about there, let go of my mouse, let go of my modifier keys, and I've got my duplicate. And I'll line up that bottom edge, get rid of the rounding just temporarily, and again turn this down to 1 point so it's easier to see, and drag the top part of this rectangle to the center of that top line of the cork. Then I'll bring in the edges so that it hits that wide extreme on the top edge. And now I need to bring in these 2 points just like I did on this rectangle on the top edge. So I'll make my selection there, switch to my scale tool, S on the keyboard, and then click and drag this in so that the edges line up nicely. Looks like right about there is at the right angle. And I might even be able to bring the top 2 points out a little bit further. So I'm going to do that. And then I'm going to round those corners off. So it looks like around 15 points again, or 15 pixels. I'll do the same thing on the bottom. I don't know if 15 is the right number for that, but we'll try it. Let's just type in 15 and see. That actually looks pretty good. I'm assuming that the original designer was using very consistent values in all of these roundings. So let me turn that back up to 6. There we go, 6. And with those 4 rectangles, I've already managed to recreate a lot of the source geometry for this bottle. So let me just switch to my outline view and see. There we go, there's 4 shapes. We're off to a good start. Let me go ahead and organize my layers a little bit so it's not getting too crazy with all these paths. I'll start with the body, and then the neck, the mouth, and that cork. Alright, next let's work on this liquid. Now this to me looks like it's based on the shape of the outside of the bottle, which makes sense. The liquid would follow the contour of the bottle. Now I could try and just do the exact same process with a rectangle and then modifying the curves, but the chances of me getting that to match the contour of the outer shape exactly are slim to none. So there's actually a really easy way to be able to do this inside of Illustrator, and it's called offset paths. So I'm going to come up with that selected to Object, Path, Offset Path. And this is going to bring up the Offset Path dialog box. First thing I want to do is click on Preview. That checkbox, you need to turn that on anytime you see it, just so you can actually see what's happening as you're adjusting the parameters. So right away we can see that it's taking the original path and then offsetting it by 10 pixels. It's pushing it out 10 pixels. And if I grab that number and just tap the up arrow, you can see that's adding more padding or expanding it out, offsetting it from the original more and more. I could also change this to a negative number. So just do that, click off of it, and now it's going inside instead of out. Now 28 is too much, so let me back that up. Looks like 18, 19, maybe even 20. I think 19, negative 19 actually looks like it's perfect on these edges. Now I have some extra up here, but I'll deal with that in a little bit. Now that that's lined up, I can click OK, and that automatically preserves my original path, so I didn't need to worry about duplicating it first. But I'm left with a shape that is making up the majority of that liquid inside. Now clearly the liquid was made in two different shapes because we have kind of this front liquid and then the back liquid right here that's kind of showing this sloshing motion. So I can't recreate this entire liquid using one shape. So I'm going to focus on just this front liquid right here first. Turn off my artwork and just look at this shape. It looks like the part of the liquid that's following the contour of the bottle, and then it dips down, dips up, and connects there. So what I need to do is add in some points where this starts to curve off and stops following the contour of the bottle. So I'm going to turn that back on and lower the stroke width on this. Just turn it back down to 1 so I can see nice and close where that curve is going to start. Looks like right about there is where I want that path. So I'm going to switch to my pen tool and click there once to add an anchor point at that spot. And then I'll come over to the point where it ends over here. So it looks like it connects right about here. I'll click once, and now I have an anchor point where that part of the curve is going to end. And then I just need to get rid of these points up here. So I'm going to just use this pen tool and click to get rid of all of these. And I think that's going to work. And that way I'm left with these handles that I can then manipulate and kind of recreate this curve now. So I need a point added right here, and it doesn't matter the angle, but I'm going to click and drag it with my direct selection tool to move it right at that crest, at the extreme of that curve. And I'll modify the handles while holding shift just to snap it to a nice horizontal alignment. Then I'll switch back to my pen tool and add another point somewhere on this line. Hold down Command to switch to my direct selection tool temporarily, and then move this anchor point all the way down from this top extreme to the low extreme, right about there. And then again, shift, while holding Command, shift click to snap that to being perfectly horizontal. Now this red is a little bit hard to see on top of the pink, so I'm going to change my layer color. To do that, you just come over to your layer and double click somewhere in this blank space. Not on top of the text, because that will rename, but somewhere over here. And then I can change the color to something bright like this yellow. I'll click OK, and now that those paths are much easier to see on top of that artwork. Now I'll just continue to adjust these handles, bring this one out, this one in, until it fits the contour of that original artwork a little bit more. And this one looks like it could be pulled out just a tad. And I actually don't think this handle needs to be going up. I'm just going to bring that down and hold shift while bringing that down a little bit, and then it looks like this doesn't need to be pulled out quite so far then. So let's look at that at our outline mode just so we can see. That looks like a very smooth, clean curve. It's coming very naturally out of this shape, curving very, very clean, very smooth, following that contour, and I think that's going to work out great for our front shape. Next, I need to make this back shape. So I'm going to start by just adding a new point. Nothing is selected right now, so I'm just going to click right here, or maybe even a little bit further up. Click and drag roughly down this way. I know I don't need it to be perfectly horizontal or vertical, so I'm just going to kind of eyeball it so I have that handle. Come down to the low point, click, hold shift and drag, and then come up to where it ends. So I actually think that it should end right here. But it kind of looks to me, it's really hard to tell at this tiny, low resolution, but it kind of looks to me like it's dipping down, coming up, and kind of rounding off to that point. So I'm going to click and drag, and I'm using this path down here as my guide to lock that handle to, so that it curves off very, naturally off of that angle on the top part right up here. So I'm locking it there. And they're letting go right about there so that it curves off very nicely from that right edge. Then I just need to modify this handle a little bit more so that it fits the actual shape of the logo, and maybe pull this one out just a tad. There we go. And I think that's going to be good. Alright, now that I have those shapes set up for the liquid, I'm going to go ahead and just finish it off with these bubbles. And it looks like they're just very basic circles. A couple of outlined versions and then a couple of probably solid circles. They're very, very tiny and they look very blocky at this resolution, but I think that those were just solid circles. So let me switch to my ellipse tool. I've got my stroke active, and then I'll just draw a perfect circle right about there for this circle, for this bubble. And then I'll just duplicate this while by holding Option with my selection tool and dragging, and then scale that one up just a little bit. Move this over while holding Option to duplicate and scale it down. I think that could go down even a little bit further. There we go. And then I just need a couple more for these filled ones. So I'm going to duplicate this, swap the fill and stroke, and then scale it down quite a bit. Maybe not quite that much. That should do it. And then I'll duplicate that over here. I'll duplicate that one up here, and this one looks a little bit smaller to me. And I think that's going to complete all of the liquid. All right, now I'm just going to bump up the stroke size on this back to 6 points. That looks good. And then on these ones, I don't think they're quite as thick. So let me just bump that up once, maybe twice. I think 3 points is going to work for those bubbles. All right, now let's do the same thing for the cork. Since I'm working with these circles, I'm just going to duplicate one of these up here and then maybe scale it down just a tad. Shift it over. And then we need another one down here. Maybe scale it up just a little bit. And then I think one's supposed to be here. Let me turn off my logo layer. And yeah, so we're missing this little chip in the glass, and that's what's covering up this circle, but I will address that in a minute. So I'm just going to duplicate another one of these bubbles, or holes probably, in the cork and scale it down. And then maybe just move it a little bit. And then I need some filled circles. So I'm going to move this one over, swap my fill and stroke, scale this down, and there we go. And I realize I'm going pretty quickly. I just don't want to continue to explain over and over again the same techniques. But once you start doing this, you will get used to quickly manipulating, duplicating, and scaling all of these objects the same way that I am. So again, I'm just holding Option, clicking and dragging, and my smart guides are really bothering me, so I'm going to press Command U to turn them off. But then I just reposition it either by clicking and dragging or using my arrows on the keyboard, and then resizing them as needed. So again, Option Shift while grabbing that transform control will bring it in proportionally from the center. It looks like we need one right down here. It's very hard to see, but I think there's supposed to be a very small circle right there in the bottom left corner. So I'm going to bring this one down right where it needs to be, and maybe even make it a tad smaller. There we go, very nice. So all the little details in the liquid and the cork are done. Really all that's left on this bottle now is this little chip in the glass and then this little hole in the cork. So how can we address these two issues? Well, for one, I could just use the pen tool and cut out a little section and kind of draw this by hand. But that is a little bit destructive. It's getting rid of my editability of this rectangle to be able to round the corners very easily and resize it very easily. There's actually a tool inside of Illustrator that we haven't used yet that's going to make this a lot more flexible. And being flexible when you're creating artwork like this is very, very valuable. So what I'm going to do is start by just tracing this shape with the pen tool in a new object. So I'll zoom in nice and close and then kind of just eyeball what I think this shape should look like. So looks like the curve is coming in a little bit like that, and then I'll hold Option to break my relationship between these two handles, and then have it go off in about, that direction. Maybe bring this handle out a little bit, and then I'll just close it all off. Now there's all these crazy corners coming off of it. Don't worry about it at this point. If we just switch to our outline mode, we can see that our paths are really all I'm concerned with. But now that I have that drawn, I can actually subtract this from this. And let me just duplicate this really quickly and give you a better view of what exactly will be happening. So I'm going to just duplicate these objects over here. My original is still saved. And I'm going to switch both of these to fill, and I'll just change the colors. So black, I'll change to like this pink. And then this black, I'll change it to the blue. So there we go. We've got our two different colors. Now if I select both of them and come over to my Properties panel, down here I have a section called Pathfinder. We only have 4 options right now, but there are more if you click on this little button right here. I want to just have more access to this next to what I'm actually doing, so I'm going to open the actual Pathfinder panel by going to Window, Pathfinder. And this is exactly the same as what's over here It's just more convenient visually right now. The Pathfinder allows you to kind of control relationships between objects and even make transformations of objects between those relationships. So let's start with this one right here. I use this one a lot. It's called minus front, and if I select both objects, right now this pink little cut is in front. So it's going to minus the front object from the back object. And if we look at the little icon before I even click on it, you see those two squares? The object in front is hollow, and the object behind is missing the section of the overlapping piece. So that's kind of giving us an indication of what's going to happen. If I click on it, there you go. It's punched a hole, literally like a cookie cutter, straight into that shape. The top object is no longer there, and instead it's just removed. It was used to cut a hole in the shape that it was overlapping, and that's it. It's gone. And if we take a look in our layers, we can see that we have just one single path now that has that hole punched in it. I'll undo, and you can see that we have both paths. The pink path that we're using on top to cut through, and then the rectangle path that this shape is based on. Redo, and it just becomes the one path. I'll undo that and take a look at the first one. This is the Unite. And if we look at those icons again, we've got two squares that look like they're being brought together. So if I click on it, there we go. The object turns entirely pink, and the parts that were overlapping are removed, and those shapes are kind of just pushed together. It's now one piece. The reason why we lost both colors is because one object can only have one fill color, so it's all the top object's color. I'll undo, and we'll take a look at this one. This is the Intersect button, and if we take a look at the icon, it looks like the overlapping portions are going to be left. So I'll click on that button, and sure enough, the overlapping portions of those two objects are what remain. If I undo, you can see this section right in here is all that's left. Alright, so what's our last option here? We've got Exclude, and that's going to do basically the opposite. I'll click, and it's getting rid of the overlapping parts of the objects and leaving what was on the outside, whatever wasn't touching. And this actually is two different shapes. If I go into Layers, we now have a group of those two different paths. So I could ungroup them and move it around. They're two different pieces. Alright, I'm going to undo one more time, and if we look at the little tooltip that pops up when I highlight or hover over one of these buttons, it's telling us in these parentheses that if you Option click, it will create a compound shape. So let's try that. I'm going to hold down Option and click. Now it looks like it did the exact same thing as before. It minused the front object from the back object. However, if I select it, you can see those paths are still there, and if I take a look at my layers, I now have something called a compound shape. A compound shape is indicating that it's using one of these Pathfinder operations to define the relationship between the objects within it. So it's kind of like a group. If I twirl it down, those two paths are still totally preserved, but it's combining those two objects based on the button that I clicked. So in this case, minus front. The great thing about it is that I can move it around now and still manipulate it non-destructively. And what I mean by that is I can continue to edit this as much as I want without losing my original paths. So that's very, very useful and makes your graphics much more flexible, which, like I said, is something that's very important to know how to do when you're working in Illustrator. Alright, now that that's done, I'm going to ignore all of these ones down here. They are useful. I do use them some of the time, but for now, we don't need to dig into them. So I'm just going to close that out, delete this example, and then move back to my original shapes and redo that same process. I'll go to my Properties panel, hold down Option to make a compound shape, and then click on that minus front. And there we go. It's cut out that little chip in the glass. And the only issue that I have now is this corner. It's kind of, sharp, and I don't want that. I want it to be rounded off. So I'll select it, come into my stroke options, and then make sure that my corner is set to round join. And that takes care of that little point, and now I've got that chip in my glass. Alright, let's do the same thing for the cork. This looks to me like it was based on a perfect circle, so I'm going to go ahead and draw that and try and align it with that cork hole on my source layer. There we go, and then I'll select both objects, go to my Properties, Pathfinder, hold down Option, and click on that minus front. Again, I have that little corner, that sharp point, so I'm going to select it, go into my stroke options, and change my corner to round join. There we go. Now I've got the little chip in the glass, I've got the round little hole in the cork, and all those small details. So all of the components that make up this bottle are there. I've created all of the paths that I need to for the actual object. And let me just move this over to the side so we can compare them side by side. That looks very close to the original logo. But you know, I think that stroke width might actually be a little bit thicker than it should be. So I'm going to undo so it's back where it needs to be, and then select all of my strokes. Now I could do this by, one by one, click, shift click on all of these, or with any of these selected, come up to the select menu, same stroke weight. Now we have options here. We could do fill and stroke, fill, color, opacity, all kinds of stuff. But if I choose stroke weight, it's only going to select the strokes that are 6 points and thickness. So I'm going to click that, and everything that had that same stroke width is now selected. And I can all at once turn this down however I want. Now there is an issue. If you notice, if I turn this way up, my cork and the mouth of the bottle are not scaling up as I'm increasing or decreasing this. And that's kind of a strange issue. So first, let me just set everything to 5, and that's going to move everything down 1 point, and I think that's going to work. But the cork and the mouth of the bottle are still at 6 points, and why in the world is that? Well, this is where kind of an annoying thing with compound shapes comes into play. What was actually happening was Illustrator was selecting the paths within the compound shapes, which is kind of a hard thing to grasp. But Illustrator allows you to style paths as well as groups or compound shapes of paths. Again, that is a kind of a confusing thing to get your head around, but basically when I selected the same stroke weight, it was going into the compound shape and stylizing those instead of the compound shape as a whole. So this is just an annoying thing that you have to be aware of and get used to, but I'm going to select both of those objects as a whole and then turn that down, and there we go. We can see that stroke point decreasing in size. So we want this to be, I think, 5 points? Yes. So now that's all consistent, and I think that's going to match the original logo a little bit more closely. Now that I've recreated the entire logo, let's go ahead and work on the colors a little bit. So first of all of the outlines are this blue color, which is the same as the blue color of the text. So I'm going to turn my logo layer back on and then make a selection of all of the strokes. So again, I'm going to select one of these and then go up to select, same, and this time say stroke color, because the weight doesn't matter, it's the color I'm concerned with. So stroke color, and my compound shapes, remember the selection is not correct, so I'm going to shift click on both of those to deselect and then reselect. Again, it's annoying, but it's just something you got to deal with. Now everything has that same stroke color of black. I'll make sure that is active by clicking on it, press I to bring up my eyedropper, and then shift click somewhere on the blue text. And there we go. Now I have that blue color, the same blue color as what was behind it, and I can now move on to these dots. So just like selecting the same stroke color, I can also select the same fill color. So I'll pick one of them, say select, same fill color, and now all of those dots are selected. I'll activate that fill color, press I to get my eyedropper, and then shift click on any of these strokes. There we go. Now I have blue fills and everything is ready to go. Now I can start filling in some of the other colors. So for instance, this cork. Now the fill is empty right now, but with it active, I'll just use my eyedropper and shift click on the cork color. But that covers up all of the dots behind it. Now this is kind of a mess right now, so let's reorganize these objects really quickly again. I'm going to rename this one cork. This is the mouth. And then we have a whole bunch of ellipses, and I think that these are kind of all over the place because of the way that I arrange them. So what I'm going to do is move the cork below all the ellipses, and I'm just going to make a selection around all of this and deselect what I don't want. So the cork and the mouth, and that way I have all of these selected. And then actually I did want the cork selected, so I'll shift click on it and then group them. And then I'll rename that group cork. And that way those are all contained into one group. And I'll do the same thing for down here. I'm going to select all of these objects at once and make sure I don't select the outer glass and group them together. And that's going to give me the liquid group, and I can move on. Now I'm going to just really quickly rearrange this, move the liquid down just above the body, and that should be good. All right, let's make the liquid pink. Now, I just grouped all this, so I need to twirl this down, find that path that makes up the outer section, and make sure to target it. And that way I'm only going to apply the eyedropper to that specific object. Press I to bring up my eyedropper, and then shift-click on the pink. There we go. Now that fill is pink. And I'll do the same thing for this path, but this time I'll just select it and click once on the other liquid, and that's going to style it exactly the same way. But we have this issue. Because this is an open path, it's not going to fill it properly. I need this fill to go down below to fill in this hole right here. If without the logo, you can see there's this nice hole that I need to fill. So I actually need to add to my path a little. I'll press P to get to my pen tool and click on this point. Come down here. It doesn't really matter because you're not going to be able to see this where I'm putting these points. But I'll just close that all off and then move that path below the other. So there, the liquid that's in the background is actually in the background in that group's layer order. Next, I just need to make sure these are rounded off joins. So I'll go to my properties, into the stroke, round off the corner, and that looks good. Now, I think I might be able to manipulate this path just a little bit, and I'll just bring this handle in so that it kind of matches this curve a little more closely. And just that little bit, see there's a kind of a little corner right here showing up where the two paths met, but just bringing this over and matching the contour of the path below it a little more closely really smooths out the transition between those two paths, especially when you back out like this. Alright, that looks great. The only issue that's left is this part of the bottle, which if I turn my original back on and my version off, you can see that this is kind of a semi-transparent version of the glass, so that the cork is kind of faded and it adds more depth to the logo. So really, I need to start by adding a background color to my document. You can see that the background color of the logo is not pure white. So I'm going to add a rectangle the same size as the document, and I'll make the fill the same color as this. So make sure that my logo layer is on, and I'll shift-click on the background of that layer, that image that I have for reference, and then draw my rectangle with my Smart Guides turned on. And there we go. It looks like that's going to snap it straight to the artboard bounds. I'll rename that rectangle BG for background and then move it down to the back of all of these shapes. I'm going to go ahead and lock that so I don't accidentally move it around. And I need to make this have basically the same color fill and then just knock back the opacity a little bit. So I'm going to shift click with the eyedropper and the fill activated on that background color, and then come into my properties and take a look at the opacity. Now you'd think that I could just turn the opacity down and that worked, except it didn't, right? The stroke also became transparent, and I don't want that. I don't want the opacity to affect the stroke, just the fill. So I could either separate the fill from the stroke and have to have two copies of the same path, or if I undo, I'll take a look at my full appearance panel by clicking on these three little dots right here, where I have more options. You can see that I have these twirl down arrows for both the fill and stroke, and inside I have opacities for each one individually. So I'll grab this opacity and then just start turning this down a little bit. So I don't know, maybe around 60% is probably about where the original was. I'd say that's pretty close. I think 60 was actually perfect. So that's good. And now I'm kind of just turning this layer on and off, comparing the paths. It looks to me like my chip in the glass is a little bit off. So I'm going to turn off the background, turn off the cork, and zoom in here a little bit, and then just reposition this. And because it's a compound shape, I'm completely free to do this without worrying about losing any of my original artwork. So I'm just manipulating these handles a little bit to see if I can reproduce this a little bit more closely to the original. Alright, turn that off and back on. I think I could pull this down just a little bit on this handle and maybe even pull this out a little further. And I gotta get nice and close in here to grab that handle. There we go. Off, on. Man, I could actually manipulate this very tediously for a while, but I think I'm going to just call that good. And yeah, that's pretty darn close. I'm happy with that. Alright, now that all of that is set up, I'll turn my background back on and just take a look, turn that off and back on, and that's a really, really accurate representation of the original logo. I'm happy with the way that that turned out. So what I need to do now is add in that text, and fortunately, my friend does know the font that he used for this logo. It's called Gastromond. So if you weren't already aware, Creative Cloud, your Adobe subscription that gives you access to all of their programs, also gives you access to a very large font library. Adobe has partnered with Typekit so that you can very quickly and easily browse hundreds and hundreds of very high quality fonts and sync them to your computer and instantly use them inside of the Adobe applications and anywhere on your computer really. So to get to that, just open up the text panel by pressing T to activate the text tool, and then if I come up to the character palette right here, I can choose which font I want to use, but right up here in the top right corner is what I'm concerned with. Add fonts from Typekit. If you click on that, it's going to bounce you into your browser and open up Adobe Typekit. And as long as you're signed into your Adobe account, you'll be able to search and sync fonts to your Adobe account very quickly. So I'm going to search Typekit right here for Gastromond. And sure enough, there it is. So I'm going to click on it. And there are two different versions, a regular and an italic. And you can even preview what text is going to look like before you download the font. So I can say School of Potion, and sure enough, that is definitely the same logo right there, same font. So I'm just going to sync both versions by clicking Sync All. And very quickly, that's just going to load. Give me that nice check mark, and I can bounce back in here. Take a look at this icon right here. You see those blue arrows is telling me that the Creative Cloud app was syncing those fonts. It's done now, and in an instant, I can start typing with that font. So I'm going to turn off my background layer just so I can see the text behind it. And then with my text tool, T on the keyboard, I will just click and type out School of Potion the same way. That's obviously way too small, so I'm going to scale it up. And then choose the right font. So up here in the character palette, which you can access through the properties panel, but I'm just going to click up here and look for the font. Now to make this a little bit easier, I'm going to click this button right here, which will filter my fonts to only showing what I have from Adobe's Typekit. So I'm going to scroll down in that list and find Gastromond. There it is. Twirl this down because there's the italic version. That's what I need. I'll click on it. And there we go, that's very close. Now I'm just going to reposition this and scale it down until it's about the same height. Now that to me looks like the same height. The S is lining up pretty well. Maybe it's a little big. Maybe that's still just a tad too big. I'm going to scale it down and then maybe scale it back up just a little bit. There we go. Alright, that is actually fitting pretty well, but by the end of it, it's completely out of alignment. But like I said, the height looks like it's the right height. So what's going on here? Well, this is kind of an indicator to me that they've added in some spacing to their text, because this is kind of gradually getting more and more out of sync with the original logo. It's kind of like exponentially spaced out differently. This type of spacing in typography is called tracking. That's a term that's used very commonly to address the spacing between multiple characters of type. In this case, it would be the entire line. If we take a look at our character palette, this little indicator right here, these two controls are very important to know how to use. This one is your tracking. And the reason why the icon has this V and the A in the highlight is because if I double click on my text and kind of draw a box, you get that same kind of highlight around it. So what this is letting you know is this value is going to affect multiple letters selected together. It's going to control the spacing between all of them equally. But if we take a look at this one right here, we have the V and the A, but a slash between them. This is letting me know that it's going to adjust the spacing directly between two characters. So if I just click once, I have this highlighting line. It's going to affect the spacing just between those two letters independently from the tracking of the overall type. This type of spacing is called kerning. So kerning and tracking are two typography terms that you definitely need to get to know, because as a designer and a motion designer, you absolutely will be using those terms and modifying these properties all the time. And we will be diving deeper into typography a little bit further down the line in this course, but for now, understanding the difference between tracking and kerning and how to use them is really going to help you when you're working with type inside of Illustrator. So first of all, I'm going to adjust the tracking because that's the overall spacing of everything. So I'm just going to have that text selected and tap this up arrow a couple times. So I'm looking at the word school, and that is actually lining up fairly well. And even the word of, I think maybe 12 did it. And that was just proportionally increasing the space between all the characters across the entire line of text. But as soon as we get to the word potion, that is off a little bit. So what this is indicating to me, since these first two words are pretty much perfect, is that there's some extra kerning added in right here between the F and the P to push this away from that F just a little bit more. So to adjust the kerning, I first need to switch to my text tool and click right where I want that kerning to be adjusted. With my highlighter right there, I can then start clicking on this. Now, as I'm doing this, it looks like basically nothing's moving. It's just tiny, tiny little increments. And that's because kerning is extremely precise. And that is usually something that you need when you're doing kerning of things like logos. You want to be very, very precise with the spacing between certain characters. But if I hold Shift, I obviously need to move this a lot more. So holding Shift will increase this by increments of 10. And there you can see that moving much quicker. So there I shifted it over maybe a little bit too much. Right there looks like the sweet spot. I'll press Escape to exit the editing, and I think that is going to line up just perfectly with the original logo. Awesome. Now all I need to do is set this to the same blue color. So I'm going to turn my background layer back on, press I to bring up the eyedropper with my fill selected, hold Shift and click on that outline. And there you go, our completed logo, 100% vector, recreated inside of Illustrator, and a very, very decent copy of the original raster image. Now that I have the completed recreation of the logo, I'm ready to send it back, but I need to do a couple more things to make sure that this is preserved exactly the way that I created it, because there's an issue with fonts when you're transferring files to other people. If they don't have that same font installed on their machine, then it's not going to display. So I need to convert this to shapes rather than editable text, and that's called outlining your type. I also want to outline the strokes, which is converting the strokes to fill. Because if, say, I give this to the printer and they scale it up and they don't have the scale strokes and effect checked, just like I don't, you see that all of those strokes look much thinner now because they didn't scale with that transform. I can completely eliminate that possibility if I convert the strokes to fills, because then they're just going to scale like any other shape. And then there's the compound paths. I don't need those extra shapes being sent to the printer because they don't need that information for when they're actually printing t-shirts. So I can get rid of all of this and clean it up and make it a very nice, easy file for the printer to deal with. But I don't want to do it on top of all of this destructively. I want to preserve this just in case I ever need to edit it again. So what I typically would be doing is saving a copy of my file that just has like a suffix of saying print ready, and that would go to the printer, and this would be my editable master file of the logo. But for the purposes of this lesson, I'm just going to make a duplicate of this layer. So this is the logo layer. I'm just going to drag it down to the new layer button and then rename this logo print ready. Then I can turn my original logo off, the reference layer off, and open this layer up. First, let's outline the type. To do that, I'm just going to select this text, which is editable, and in the outline view, you can see that it's editable because it's filled. But if I come up to Type, down to Create Outlines, and click, that's going to convert this to actual shape paths. And if I press Command Y to get my outline view again, there you go, it's no longer filled with black, it's these outlined paths, and I can even manipulate these just like any other path. So if you ever needed to edit text to be a different looking shape, or maybe you needed to make this eye, the dot of the eye a little bit smaller, you could do that after you've outlined it. Alright, just like that, the text is taken care of. Now let's start outlining the strokes. So I'm just going to select one of these, come up to Object, go down to Path, and then say Outline Stroke. And just like the text, my stroke is no longer editable. I can't increase or decrease it because there isn't one. It's now just a filled shape. Now I can do multiple shapes at once, so I'm just going to select everything and go up to Object, Path, Outline Stroke, and that caused a big issue. What in the world happened to my cork and the bottle top here? Well, the issue is that those were compound shapes, and Illustrator is going to give us kind of some trouble if we don't expand this compound shape first. So to take care of this, I'm going to select the bottle mouth right there, and I'm going to come up to Object and look at this option right here, Expand Appearance. If I click that, that is going to get rid of the compound shape. It's basically applying that transformation as if I had just clicked on the minus front button without holding Option. So it's kind of just committing that operation and really converting this into an expanded object. So this is still showing up as a group, and it even has a couple of groups inside of it, which is a little strange. And what these are the stroke separate from the fill. So if I take the mouth and just ungroup it, I'm left with these two groups, and the first one is the outline, and the second one is the fill. So it's a little bit of an annoyance, but it's not too big of a problem because of the way that we're preparing the file. So I'm just going to quickly go through the cork and do the same thing. Select that cork group, go up to Object, Expand Appearance, and that commits that Pathfinder command. So I'm left with just that shape, and now I can make a selection of everything else, come up to Object, and say Path, Outline, Stroke. Now all of my strokes are fills. I don't have to worry about any of that scaling incorrectly, but I still have lots and lots of paths overlapping where they really don't need to. So I have all these paths behind for that one shape that I had to draw behind the front liquid, and I can clean this up very quickly using another one of our Pathfinder commands. So I'm going to make my selection around the bottle, come into Properties, and find my Pathfinder and open that up. Down here is the Merge button, and it's very similar looking to the Unite button. The difference is if I click Unite, it makes everything one solid shape, same colors. Everything is merged into one. If I undo that and come down to the Merge button, the appearance stays almost exactly the same. The only difference is this shape right here lost its opacity, but that's an easy fix. The important thing is that all of the colors remain the same, but we got rid of all those extra paths in the background. That's before and after. My outline mode shows this is much, much cleaner now. So what's going on is that it's merging everything together, but preserving all of the individual colors. So it's just getting rid of all the paths that you don't see and making it a much more clean file. But there is one big issue. If I switch back to my outline mode, you see that all of the overlapping part of the cork that went behind this mouth disappeared. It completely got rid of it, even though this was semi-transparent. So I need to undo and instead deselect that one object, the one that is overlapping the cork, and then click on Merge. So I'll go back to my Pathfinder, click on Merge, and there we go. Now everything has been merged together except for this one shape, which I'll take care of in just a second. But this has cleaned everything up, gotten rid of all of those overlapping paths while preserving the individual colors and just making it all a much cleaner piece of art to hand off to the printers. Now, for this one transparency issue, I can fix this just by selecting the mouth as a whole and then clicking on Merge. So I'll go to that, click on Merge, and then all that's left is lowering the opacity of this shape back down to 60. And there we go. Now it's much cleaner. It's trimmed off the overlapping portions once more, and I'm left with my logo for the bottle, which is grouped. If I select it, you can see everything gets selected, and I'll even show you in the layers. There we go. We've got two groups, one for the first set of objects that I merged together, and then one for the second with transparency. I'm going to go ahead and ungroup these by selecting one of them, pressing Command-Shift-G, and that splits all those shapes out into their own ungrouped layers, and I'll do the same thing for this piece, Command-Shift-G. And then finally, this group right here is my text after I outlined it, so I'm just going to rename this one Text, and I'll leave that one as is because I don't want any of those shapes getting moved around separate from each other. Remember, we set up that tracking and kerning to be exactly the way that it is, so I'm just going to leave it as is. And everything else being on its own layer is actually a good thing for the printer. So I'm going to leave it just like that, and this would be ready to hand off back to my friend to send to the printer. Now, I'm going to keep a copy, like I said, of the original logo so that I have the flexibility of modifying anything, including the stroke weight, if I need to. But this file is ready to go. It's all cleaned up, and I can know that when I hand it off to somebody else, it's always going to look like this as long as they don't start manipulating the paths. Alright, I know that was kind of a process, but like I said, this is something that happens in the world more often than I'd like to admit. So it's something that would be very valuable for you to know how to do, whether it's tracing a logo or any object for that matter. Recreating something like this from scratch and knowing how to prepare files to give to somebody else in case you need to make sure that it is not edited is very important. So I'm going to hand this file off to my friend. Hopefully he'll get his t-shirts made and we don't have any other issues.